In this iteration, my colleague at Newcastle, Emily Monaghan-Laurent, and I were asked to coordinate and spearhead 2 panels of a distinct format. These panels and the discussion to follow are based on single texts we have deemed relevant, timely, and crucial for any discussion of the complex relationships amongst psychoanalysis and philosophy, and the question of with what, how, and why this discourse should or even can continue. So you'll hear 4 brief expositions of a text, a metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams by Freud, and then a moderated discussion amongst the panelists aimed at generating further discussion outside of this panel, and perhaps in response to other presentations at this conference. So you won't be hearing absolutely original research, but rather be subject to the disciplined, somewhat less glamorous labor of close reading and the extraction of questions. I selected today's text because of its rich liaisons not only to the general theory of dreams, the question of the dream work and its bearing on the philosophical designation of meaning and interpretation, but also to the general problem of detailing the faculties of the psyche. Indeed, those of you who were present at the first part of these conferences will recall 2 presentations in particular that demonstrated the philosophical import of Freudian metapsychology. Namely, Alinka Zupancic's presentation on fantasy, wherein she highlighted the speculative and provocative character of Freud's portrait of reality testing, as well as today Troja's presentation on the undergirding methodology guiding the construction of Freud's case histories, and this methodology's properly philosophical articulation qua metapsychology. In the readings and questions generated today by Marisa, Voranc, Aleš, and I, we will be taking up lines of inquiry in the veins already punctured by Alinka and today in November. Marisa will discuss Freud's identification of the function of dreams in maintaining nightly sleep, turning our attention to the features and functions of the nightmare and its disturbance or not of sleep. Voranc will highlight the philosophical import of reality testing and the distinction between the internal and the external that subtends reality testing, focusing especially on Freud's spatial metaphors. Aleš will be drawing out the epistemological features of Freud's remarks on reality testing and their relation to the seeming triviality of Freud's objects of study. And I will develop Freud's speculative remark about psychosis and reality testing in relation to the literary writings of someone diagnosed with acute paranoid psychosis, and to what extent her writings suggest something about the foundation of reality testing. And then following this, the 4 of us will work in conversation to explore, solidify, and perhaps even contest one another's developments of Freud's texts. And my hope is that these text-based panels serve as anchors for our days here in the Atri. So with that, I will turn it over to Marisa to start us off.
Okay, thank you. I would first also like to greet you all and thank you for coming to this first session. I would also like to thank the conference organizers today and Lorenzo, and of course our panel coordinator Holden for putting all this together for the continuation of part 2, and for gathering us all here to comment on and discuss this intriguing text by Sigmund Freud. So the line that I'm trying to follow here is quite simple. I will structure my commentary around Freud's description of the act of escape or withdrawal in and out of dreams, which he uses when describing the processes of falling asleep and withdrawing from the waking state into the dream state, and waking up due to a bad dream, and thus withdrawing again, but this time away from dreams. What I want to trace here is that Freud's theory of dreams establishes, if not 2 categories, then in a more topological sense, 2 points of escape, of breaking in and out, if you will, in relation to the dream and waking state. So the first, as mentioned, is the escape into dreams, an escape or withdrawal from our waking life. The second follows a very similar path, but with a twist and in a different direction, the escape from dreams, the interruption of the sleep state that plunges the sleeper in another way, or simply put, manages to wake them up, which results in the exact opposite of what Freud says is a purpose of dreaming. So this dynamic between the 2 movements is something that I found intriguing when reading the text, and that I would like to explore with and through Freud's theory. So Freud begins a metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams with a description of sleepers' activities every night when they lie down to sleep. He describes their undressing as them, I quote, laying aside the wrappings in which they have enveloped their skin. He equates taking off their glasses, wigs, and dentures with them taking off their supplements to the bodily organs with which they compensate for during the day, calling them false hair and false teeth in opposition to the real hair and real teeth that this type of unveiling sleeper obviously lacks, perhaps already implying the sleeper's return to their more truthful or less wrapped up version of themselves. It seems that Freud is already here subtly hinting at the division between real and false, the division that he will emphasize almost at the very end of the text when he refers to the mechanism of reality testing. And it is the division that one should perhaps keep in mind throughout the reading of the metapsychological supplement. So he goes on to say that this stripping away of all these substitutes is analogous to undressing of the mind, as he calls it, and laying aside most of the sleeper's psychical acquisitions. With the double act of undressing, the sleeper reactivates its intrauterine existence, attempts to exclude external stimuli, and withdraws from the outside world. So as Freud puts it, the sleeper ceases to be interested in the outside world and describes the process of falling asleep as, I quote, the withdrawal of all psychical catexes from the external world back to the ego. So this is where he locates the function of what he would call a guardian of sleep. And as we know, this guardian is the sleep themselves. So the reader quickly realizes that Freud himself probably had no difficulties with sleep. He's even said to have described himself as an excellent sleeper. Whether we are envious of this alleged fact or not, we must accept this very premise that one of the first prerequisites for Freud's research on the subject is that one must fall asleep, and only then does the first step towards fulfilling the conditions for analysis begin. And this is not all, but in fact, for a dream interpretation to be had, one must enter the dream state, one must dream. In addition, one must remember the dreams after waking up so that there's any material at all for the interpretation. However, the big topic in Freud's interpretation of dreams is definitely the question of memory, or why are dreams so easily forgotten after waking up? So right at the beginning of his famous expedition on the subject of dreams, he writes that the first step must be to differentiate between sleep and dreams. And as we all know, he focuses on the latter. So in his interpretation of dreams, as well as in the metapsychological supplement that we are focusing on today, his concern is indeed dreams, noting that they are an object to which we are not in the habit of devoting much thought, since we usually sleep and encounter it every night. So this may all seem a little obvious, but none of it really is when we cross over to the territory of psychoanalysis and of philosophy as well. Bachelard once wrote, "A dream visited me," and with this emphasis on the passivity of the sleeper who does not actively dream, but is instead visited by dreams, Bachelard turned his attention away from the nocturnal form of dreams and focused instead on poetic reveries, daydreams in which he located the role of the subject as their active force, and then decided to leave the others, the nocturnal visitors, to psychoanalysis. Perhaps he would not always be in agreement with Freud, especially with his emphasis on the passive role of the dreamer, which Freud would probably not accept, but the place of their meeting could perhaps lie precisely there, in the conclusion that dreams are an object and a problem for psychoanalysis. And everything, however banal, obvious, or self-evident it may seem, it is of interest to Freud, who could be said to have denied the existence of the obvious as a banal object. And this may well be the key for thinking of dreams, not only psychoanalytically, but also philosophically. For what does it really mean that something is obvious anyway? The acceptance of it, its affirmation, is probably the point at which both philosophy and psychoanalysis end. So to return to the question of the relationship between sleep and dreams, it can be said that although they're different, they continue to persist in a specific coexistence. For Freud, the dream is not only a wish fulfillment, but it also functions as a guardian of sleep. However, there is always something present that can disturb it. It is something that in the supplement, Freud attaches to the notion of interruption when he refers to the process of dream work and its end product, the construction of dreams. In this sense, he seems to understand interruption as an integral part of the dream process. He writes that, I quote, "A dream tells us that something was going on which intended to interrupt sleep, and it enables us to understand in what way it has been possible to fend off this interruption." End of quote. So the dreams thus lead directly back to the process that produced them. In this case, the interruption is described as a kind of a trigger for processes that contribute to their formation. Freud continues that, I quote, "The final outcome is that the sleeper has dreamt and is able to go on sleeping. The internal demand, which was striving to occupy him, has been replaced by an external experience whose demand has been disposed of. A dream is, therefore, among other things, a projection, an externalization of an internal process." So this is in line with a basic structure of dream formation that Freud describes in the interpretation of dreams, and which, as he notes, proceeds in a kind of a zigzag. Progressive, regressive, and then progressive again. First, we have a wish to sleep, which turns the sleeper inward and withdraws them from the outside world. It draws in all the catexes sent out by the ego, and this is something Freud describes as the narcissism of sleep. But there is an interruption, something that does not obey the wish to sleep. While the preconscious is occupied by the wish to sleep, there is another wish present that stems from the unconscious. The unconscious wish links itself with the day's residues and seeks to force its way through to the preconscious, but its path is blocked by censorship, which itself is half asleep during sleep and is weakened compared to the waking state, but not completely. It subdues it and distorts it in its expression. The forward movement in the direction of consciousness is thus prevented by the sleep state in which the preconscious is situated, and the censorship is followed by a regressive change of direction in a dream process. And this is what Freud means in the supplement by fending off the interruption. On this regressive path, it gains representability as the content of the dream process becomes perceptual. Here, I quote, "The preconscious dream wish is formed, which gives expression to the unconscious impulse in the material of the preconscious day's residues." So Freud defines this last direction of movement as progressive again, as that which has been transformed now resumes the path it took before it was censored, but now manages to bypass the censorship and the sleep state of the preconscious and attract the attention of the consciousness. So once a dream becomes a perception, it can excite the consciousness and thus also the sleeping preconscious. The latter binds the dream's unconscious excitations and renders it powerless to act as a disturbance. Freud uses the metaphor of brushing away a fly here. The sleeper wakes up, but only for a moment, and sleep continues while the sleeper dreams. In this particular sense, Freud claims that dreams always have an arousing effect as they awaken the preconscious. Dreaming, therefore, takes on the task of bringing back under control of the preconscious the excitation of the unconscious. It serves as a safety wall, says Freud, and preserves the sleep of the preconscious. It is a compromise, a fulfillment of two wishes, he adds, insofar as they are compatible. With this, he already hints at the possibility of a scenario in which dreams find themselves in a different role, in which their useful function becomes useless and disruptive under the changed conditions that have brought them about, and they transform from the guardian to the disturber of sleep. The intention to sleep thus encounters an interruption that, instead of keeping the sleeper in a state of sleep, awakens him. In the supplement, Freud comments on this problem. He says, "We are acquainted too with the extreme case where the ego gives up the wish to sleep because it feels unable to inhibit the repressed impulses set free during sleep. In other words, where it renounces sleep because of its fear of its dreams." And in the interpretation of dreams, he says something similar when he refers to the dreams that have the power to rouse us in the middle of our sleep. We can ask ourselves, he says, why a dream, that is, an unconscious wish, is giving the power to interfere with sleep, that is, with the fulfillment of the preconscious wish. To illustrate this, Freud refers here to the famous illustration of the formation of the anxiety dream and the wish fulfillment through the fairy tale of the married couple, the fairy godmother, and the pair of sausages. In short, the fairy godmother offers the couple 3 wishes. The wife looks over at the neighbors, is tempted, and wishes for sausages just like theirs. The husband gets angry and then wishes for sausages to be hung on her nose. And then the 3rd wish offers itself, really, which of course consists of the sausages disappearing altogether. So the fulfillment of one person's wish can bring discomfort to another if they are not in agreement with one another. Freud thus opposes the objection that the theory of dreams as wish fulfillment is incompatible with the existence of anxiety dreams, and claims that a psychical process that develops anxiety can nevertheless be a wish fulfillment. As he himself says, there is no doubt that the fulfillment of dreams must bring pleasure, and this raises the question, to whom? And so he continues, to the one who has a wish. The dreamer, however, he notes, has a peculiar relationship with his wishes. He does not like them. Their fulfillment can therefore bring him no pleasure, but quite the opposite. So I'll end here very briefly, because I believe that I have managed to get at least partly a hold of this dynamic of sleep versus awakening, carrying out with the effect of dreams and the dream processes. If we place it in the operative framework of the internal-external, we have seen that withdrawal from the outside world and falling asleep supports the regressive redirection of the dream process that the unconscious excitations take after their first encounter censorship. Dream formation is successful with the occurrence of this interruption and its consequent return as dreams. However, the first interruption can also trigger the transformation of dreams into a disruption of sleep itself. The danger always exists, says Freud. The conditions for its realization are the occurrence of the repressions and the sufficiently strong existence of the suppressed wishful impulses. The purpose of repression is to prevent the release of unpleasure. If the catalysis from the preconscious cease, the unconscious excitations may release an effect that can only be experienced as unpleasure, as anxiety. Or as we read in the supplement, he says, the stronger the unconscious instinctual catalyses are, the more unstable is sleep. And then, again, the last quote, in the interpretation of dreams, he says, the dream process is allowed to begin as a fulfillment of an unconscious wish, but if this attempted wish fulfillment jars upon the preconscious so violently that it's unable to continue sleeping, then the dream has made a breach in the compromise and has failed to carry out the second half of its task. In that case, the dream is immediately broken off and replaced by a state of complete waking. End of quote. So another externalization is at work here, not only the one that externalizes the inner processes and produces a dream. This time, it is in a function through the transformative nature of dreams themselves into anxiety dream, of breaking with an anxiety-inducing sleep state and fulfilling another wish, the wish to wake up and say with relief, it was only a dream. Thank you.
So it's my turn. Greetings. Thank you all for coming. And I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this chance and inviting me to this panel. So my commentary will go the other way around, so to speak, which I think is in a way also a characteristic of the text we are debating today, as it is already stated in its title. It is called the supplement to the theory of dreams. Without going into too much detail, let us just say that in it Freud returns to his dream theory, or specifically to chapter 7 of the interpretation of dreams, in order to reconsider some of the problems he uncovered in it. A lot has happened both for Freud and for psychoanalysis between the work and the supplement. The latter was conceived in 1915, as were several other formative metapsychological texts to which Freud makes implicit or explicit reference, or which simply take up the same problems. So understanding the text in question really depends on the broader field of Freud's work. My approach will therefore be similar in that I will begin with the concept of reality testing, with which Freud concludes the supplement, and then in my commentary revisit and expand on certain passages from texts dealing with the points in question, most notably on narcissism, drives and their vicissitudes, the unconscious, and Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Freud conceives the concept of reality testing as a solution to a problem that raises a multitude of questions, starting with the question, how can we distinguish realities from our ideas? And in Freudian fashion, he compares pathological phenomena with what might be called normal ones, the mechanism of dreams with the psychotic mechanism of delirium, for example. In the metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams, he opens the concluding part of the text, which focuses on this distinction as follows. I quote, "Let us be clear that the hallucinatory wishful psychosis in dreams or elsewhere achieves two by no means identical results. It not only brings hidden or repressed wishes into consciousness, it also represents them with the subject's entire belief as fulfilled. The concurrence of these two results calls for an explanation. It is quite impossible to maintain that unconscious wishes must necessarily be taken for realities when once they have become conscious. For as we know, our judgment is very well able to distinguish realities from ideas and wishes, however intense they may be. On the other hand, it seems justifiable to assume that belief in reality is bound up with perception through the senses. When once a thought has followed the path to regression as far back as to the unconscious memory traces of objects, and thence to perception, we accept the perception of it as real. The hallucination brings belief in reality with it." 2 paragraphs later, he again notes, "Let us furthermore bear in mind the great practical importance of distinguishing perceptions from ideas, however intensely recalled. Our whole relation to the external world, to reality, depends on our ability to do so." End of quote. In this passage, Freud links reality with exteriority, but at the same time emphasizes the elusiveness of this exteriority, which is not so easy to distinguish from fantasy, dream, or reverie. In order to be able to distinguish one from the other, reality from wishful hallucination, something must first happen which gives us the ability to orient ourselves in the world. Freud emphasizes this point shortly afterwards. I quote, In the earlier passage we described to the still helpless organism a capacity for making a first orientation in the world by means of its perceptions, distinguishing external and internal according to the relation to its muscular action." End of quote. The earlier passage mentioned above refers to the text Drives and Their Vicissitudes, where Freud breaks down the concept of the organism to its minimal characteristics in order to describe its conditions, beginning with the problem in question, the distinction between internal and external impulses, and thus becoming of an organism through spatial orientation. The text opens up with the criteria by which instinctive stimuli can be distinguished from other stimuli. The first characteristic is that instinctive stimuli come from within the organism, whereas sensory stimuli come from outside of it. The second characteristic of the drive is that it presents itself to perception in the form of a constant force and not as a momentary impact. And lastly, since the drive comes from within in the form of a constant pressure, there is no escaping it, at least not in the way we can escape or get away from other stimuli that come from the outside, so sensory stimuli. The inability to escape the drives forces the organism toward the external world and forces it to act upon it. I'm quoting the passage in which Freud makes this point. External stimuli impose only the single task of withdrawing from them. This is accomplished by muscular movements, one of which eventually achieves that aim, and thereafter, being the expedient movement, becomes a hereditary disposition. Instinctual stimuli, which originate from within the organism, cannot be dealt with in the same way by this mechanism. Thus, they make far higher demands on the nervous system and cause it to undertake involved and interconnected activities by which the external world is so changed as to afford satisfaction to the internal source of stimulation. End of quote. We can now see that the first orientation that Freud mentions is also formative for this organism in its minimal conditions, since it also shapes its relationship to the world and it's consequentially constituted through it, and thus becomes a spatial organism or something that can only come about within the internal-external relation. What has to happen for the organism to come to be through this first orientation, or in the other words, to be able to distinguish reality from desire, is what Freud calls reality testing. It is no more than taking advantage of the last point of the criteria mentioned above, which states that an organism cannot escape from the internal pressures through muscular action, while it is able to escape from the external influences in just this way. Thus, if the organism cannot make perception disappear, a certain perception disappear through muscular action, this means that this perception is internal. The need for orientation and the institution of reality testing arises from the fact that without it, consciousness cannot distinguish between an internal instinctual stimulus and an external stimulus. Freud emphasizes this point in The Unconscious. I quote, "In psychoanalysis, there is no choice for us but to assert that mental processes are in themselves unconscious and to liken them to perception of them by the means of consciousness, and to liken the perception of them by means of consciousness to the perception of the external world by means of the sense organs." End of quote. It happens sometimes that the organism cannot meet the demands made by the drives, and so wants to escape from them just as he escapes from other stimuli. Under certain conditions, it can project the inner demands outwards, or as Freud says in the supplement, that's why the organism takes such pains to transpose outwards what becomes troublesome to him from within, that is, to project it. End of quote. It is able to do this because, since perceptions bear no sign of their origin and therefore cannot be correctly located in space without the institution of reality testing, they can be exchanged or transposed as long as the institution of reality testing is suspended temporarily for various reasons. This can happen with mental illness, but it also happens every night when we sleep. in the mechanism of projection, it becomes clear that what we call internal and external is in a sense both outside for our perception. So we could say that consciousness knows two externalities, the inside one and the outside one, and thus can transpose representations between them. On this constitutive orientation in the world, Freud also makes the distinction between ego libido and object libido in his text on narcissism, and later takes up this problem again in his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, where he recalls the topological metaphor of protoplasmic pseudopodia. So I quote, "To put the matter shortly, we picture the relation of ego libido to object libido in a way which I can make plain to you by an analogy from zoology. Think of those simplest of living organisms, the amoebas, which consist of a little differentiated globule of protoplasmic substance. They put out their protrusions, known as pseudopodia, into which they cause the substance of their body to flow over. They are able, however, to withdraw the protrusions once more and form themselves again into a globule. While we compare the putting out of these protrusions to the emission of libido onto the objects, while the main mass of the libido can remain in the ego. And we suppose that in normal circumstances, ego libido can be transformed unhindered into object libido, and that this cannot once more be taken back into the ego." End of quote. The pseudopodia metaphor strikes me because of its plasticity that it possesses, which represents the character of Freud's thinking, but also represents the nature of mental processes themselves. The possibility of transforming ego libido into object libido only comes into play because this possibility is already present in the spatial concept of the organism. The membrane of the cell is what the membrane is, a boundary between two regions of pressure, the internal and the external one in correspondence. Freud builds on this topology of mental processes when he writes the unconscious, when he writes in the unconscious about the systems, the unconscious one, the preconscious, and the conscious, and their relations. He proposes a different spatial metaphor this time, perhaps the one with less plasticity, but possibly more analytical, while the notion of the boundary is represented by, is in this metaphor represented by a door or a threshold instead of the membrane. I quote, "The crudest idea of these systems is the most convenient for us. It's a spatial one. Let us compare the system of the unconscious to a large entrance hall in which the mental impulses jostle one another like separate individuals. Adjoining this entrance hall, there is a second, narrower room, a kind of drawing room, in which consciousness too resides. But on the threshold between these two rooms, a watchman performs his function. He examines the different mental impulses, acts as a censor, and will not admit them into the drawing room if they displease him." Thinking about the mental apparatus by means of spatial metaphors means following the vicissitudes of psychic instances and representations. The metaphors of the plasmopodia and the two adjoining rooms give space for thinking about the dynamic processes like repression and projection, which cannot be thought of in static terms. By using metaphors not only to explain but also to think theory, Freud also follows the unconscious in its regression to things, the evidence of which are our dreams themselves. As he says in the supplement, that, I quote, "It is very noteworthy how little the dream work keeps to the word presentations. It's always ready to the word presentation, sorry. It's very noteworthy how little the dream work keeps to the word representations. It's always ready to exchange one word for another till it finds the expression which is most handy for plastic presentation." And states, and Freud states on the same page that we, I quote, are apt to forget that for a dream, all operations with words are no more than preparation for a regression to things. At this point, I leave us with a concluding question for further debate afterwards. It's perhaps more of a kickoff point than a question, actually. What are the theoretical consequences for the institution of reality testing that spring up with the spatial concept of the orientation in the world, if there are any, or should we think of it topologically from the outset? Something to think of in the way of rooms and single-celled organisms, maybe. Thank you.
So hello everyone. I won't thank anyone even if I wish to because I'm too shy for that. So just let me begin. The title of my presentation is Contingency Testing, and the first thing I would like to do is to apologize for the stupid pun on Freud's notion of reality testing. In my excuse, it was a forced choice, so I could shamelessly insert into the topic of discussion, namely Freud's text, A Metapsychological Supplement to the Theory of Dreams, my experience, or rather an idea derived from this experience of reading. And I had a hunch that we all would somehow say, haha, there is no reality, so I tried to somehow bypass this problem. So actually what I try to offer is more of an indication of an idea for an exploration of Freudian psychoanalysis rather than a concept or even a statement about the latter. So what I would like to do in this short paper is to contribute to the Freudian discussion by way of describing what I find fascinating and at the same time annoying when reading Freud's texts. Since I haven't read the whole bunch of them, and since there is probably already a Lacanian answer to this dilemma lying somewhere in his seminars, I will at least try to pose the question in such a way that it might produce different, maybe even competing answers. I always find fascinating how Freud took little things seriously, with strict theoretical vigor and scientific will for classification. When one opens up his psychopathology of everyday life, which deals with exactly this kind of little things which we don't even pay any real attention to during the day, and when one checks the index of the book, he can find in the chapter titles the following: forgetting of names, mistakes in speech, reading and writing, errors and even chance actions or contingent acts. Freud wrote a full book on such seemingly unimportant phenomena, and of course another one on the topic of jokes and another one on dreams. Dreams are here perhaps a little bit different, since they once were an important phenomena, a cryptic revealing of truth or fate in the human mind as its cosmological beyond. But in the age of scientific positivism, one didn't take so seriously manifestly confusing content of dreams, except Freud. Through such little and slippery phenomena, he tried to determine and stabilize his theoretical object, namely the unconscious. And on these unimportant, inessential phenomena, he tried to build foundations for a new science that this object demanded, namely psychoanalysis. So to lay foundations for a new science, focusing on such little and unimportant phenomena, this is what I found utmost fascinating when reading Freud. One can only admire his Wesensschau. Nothing escapes his piercing theoretical vision. But on the other hand, one can sometimes get the feeling that Freud sees a little bit too much or a little bit too deep into the essence of the inessential. For example, when reading the interpretation of dreams, one can follow Freud's slow and methodical articulation of the main concept, the fulfillment of the unconscious desire. From undistorted dreams, in which we can almost immediately discern latent thoughts out of manifest content of dreams, to at a first sight almost incomprehensible or insensible dreams where wish fulfillment has a bad taste of anxiety to it. But through this methodical journey, one can get confused and ask himself, if these are the same type of dreams, is unconscious desire also present in undistorted dreams? If this desire is unconscious, then they have to have an unpleasant effect. They have to feel wrong, or else their desire wouldn't have a reason to be unconscious. Freud, being methodical as ever, provides for an answer: secondary revision. Through this mechanism of dream work, which is of course the true side of the unconscious in its effectivity, such distortion is at least somewhat repaired or remade into seemingly normal and undistorted dreams. A cover-up. This is a perfectly fine and consistent answer, but it does leave one wondering: how do we know Or how do we recognize the unconscious if it tends to hide in its effects, or at least has the ability to do so? It hides not behind the effects or within its phenomena, but precisely in its effects. It waits for us to go to sleep at night and covers up the traces of its own work when the dreams get too intense, thus directly showing itself as a given, simple wish that is fulfilled. And during the day, it waits for us to do freely what we want, and when our intentional act deviates just a little bit, it hides itself in accidental circumstances of such an unimportant detour, thus showing itself as neglectable. From this follows the annoying part of reading Freud. One gets the feeling that every unimportant mistake or deviation could be the effect of the unconscious. So in principle, there can be no unimportant mistakes or deviations that wouldn't be the victim of the cunning of the unconscious. Can a dream be just a dream and a sleep just a sleep? Can some unimportant events remain just unimportant, even to the unconscious? And this annoyance is not so much a personal feeling as it is a philosophical problem. If psychoanalysis is truly a science, as Freud always intended it to be, what are its limits? If even the unimportant phenomena cannot elude the cunning of the unconscious, Freud constantly walked the epistemological line. His fascinating theoretical insight led him to posit a new theoretical object out of little and unimportant empirical phenomena. But at the same time, any scientific endeavor also demands a demonstration of stability of the object in its own constant effectuations in empirical phenomena, which in this case, when we are dealing with little, slippery, unimportant events, might demand even more from a demonstration, a practically endless enumeration and classification of its various occurrences. And this is, by the way, how I try to understand Freud's endless listing of examples and defining and classifying them into fixed symbols, which is, of course, something that on various occasions he himself criticized. And also I understand like his endless revisions and expansions of already published works, which like proliferate through years. In any case, the object, in order to be an object, has to be determined. It has to be limited. Not empirically, but theoretically. In principle, something has to elude the domain of effectivity of the unconscious. I know I'm not saying anything new, and this is a well-known problem. It might not even be specific to Freud and psychoanalysis, and is perhaps common to all great minds that established a whole new discursivity. But I think there is nonetheless a detail specific to Freud. He focused on the inessential, the unimportant, slips, jokes, dreams. And Freud, in fact, was aware of this problem, and he did establish a fuse for trespassing this epistemological line. In fact, he posited two, or at least two. The first is called reality testing, and is connected with dreams. But as opposed to slips and jokes, dreams include this peculiarity that they take over the sensory experience when we are asleep. Freud calls this a topographical regression, which is a regression in the sense that a physical innervation or a psychological impulse goes through the whole psychic apparatus, but instead of ending as a release through motility or motoric functioning of the body, it falls back on sensory experience and fashions it by itself. Cut off from the outside, dreams are hallucinations of wish fulfillment made by our own working psyche in our sleep. But if our psyche is working even when we are asleep, how do we know that we are awake when we think we are awake? Maybe this is just a dream wish being fulfilled. Doesn't any desire include the desire for itself to be real? As Freud nicely puts it, the dream wish is hallucinated, and as a hallucination, meets with the belief in the reality of its fulfillment, end of quote. We can immediately see the problem. If the unconscious desire is so strong that it could literally devour reality as such, how can we know that we are not hallucinating even when we are awake? To put it bluntly, if we know that we are hallucinating at night when we sleep, how do we know that we are not psychotic at day and hallucinating at broad daylight? This is why Freud needs reality testing. Even if he speaks of the unconscious as a defining feature of human psyche as such, there would be no sense of any kind of therapy without at least a minimal difference between the normal and the pathological. And in the final analysis, Freud is definitely much more concerned with therapy than philosophical issues. So reality testing is a solution of the problem of limits of psychoanalysis imposed by theoretical or practical reasons instead of epistemological or philosophical ones. This actually might be the reason that it is in no way convincing, even if it might be a good heuristic tool for practice. Reality testing posits that the relations of power, if I may use this expression here, that the relations of power of psychic apparatus is on the side of voluntary motoric reaction. So even if we are hallucinating something, we can, in the end, get rid of it by way of doing something with our bodily movement. This is for Freud the proof of that consciousness is in power, that it is in control of the psychic apparatus. To put it differently, to eat the pudding is not so much the proof of the pudding itself, but of us being normal. If the pudding disappears, the pudding is, or rather it was, real, and our consciousness in control of our psyche. But for my taste, this test is a bit too abstract. If the test is applied to a filthy rich person, the pudding will not disappear. The whole invisible staff of the bourgeois will make it reappear like a constant invisible magic trick. But the rich are not insane, they're just rich, they can eat the pudding and have it too. And if we don't have an invisible staff doing magic tricks because we are poor, why would we even want to do the test? Why even try to make the pudding disappear? To leave it where it is, nearby, not caring if it's real or hallucinated, might be the most sensible or normal thing to do in such a situation. A joke aside, reality testing is not really convincing, and even more importantly, it does not address the proper philosophical issue, that of the limitation of the effectivity of the unconscious itself. For the cunning of the unconscious is in its ability to work its way of producing effects exactly when our consciousness is in control of the psychic apparatus. So Freud proposes another test, which I would like to call contingency testing. In this case, the test is derived from the problem that he encounters when considering slips, these little detours in our speaking and acting. At the end of his Psychopathology of Everyday Life, we can find a chapter, which is the last one, and it's called Determinism, Chance, and Superstitious Belief. Freud uses here the word Zufall, which might be better translated as contingency, because chance is a bit more quantitative notion and is mathematical in its origins, namely it comes from theory of probability and game theory. In any case, Freud here addresses the issue of seeking and seeing a hidden meaning in random occurrences in contingent events. But it is not just psychoanalysis that is on the lookout for little phenomena with big implications. This is also precisely what a superstitious person does, as Freud himself stresses. And the superstitious person is the exact opposite of a scientist. Even more, a superstitious person is in his structure of reasoning similar to a paranoid psychotic. But for Freud, of course, there is a difference between superstition and psychoanalysis, or between a psychotic and a psychoanalyst, who would in this case be hallucinating his own cunning object in unimportant phenomena. The former is projecting his own issues into the outside. He doesn't admit that external contingent phenomena are in fact the effects of his own unconscious, while the former would see in them precisely the effects of his own unconscious, on one condition, where his psychic life is involved in the causal chain of his own situation. And this addition is crucial, because, as Freud puts it himself, I believe in external real chance, but not in internal psychical accidental events. End of quote. So yes, for Freud there are unimportant events that do and even must remain unimportant for a person to be non-pathological and non-superstitious, and for psychoanalysis to delineate its object. There are important, unimportant, and unimportant events for Freud and psychoanalysis. Contingency testing seems a bit more adequate for the job than reality testing. But the problem nonetheless persists. Freud in fact merely displaces it, but this displacement enables us to posit a more precise definition of the problem. Freud does indeed prove that there are unimportant events, which are beyond the cunning ability of effectuation of the unconscious. But can this ability be limited when our psychic life itself is in fact involved in the chain of events? To put it differently, is there a contingency for the unconscious in the human psyche itself? And where in the psychic apparatus would it be? As I have said in the beginning, I don't have a concept as an answer to this problem, but I would at least like to show an idea for where to look for. I would not look for it in the topicality of psychic apparatus, with the unconscious, preconscious, and consciousness. I don't think that the main issue is the undistractable character of the unconscious. Even if we don't agree with its perennial temporal persistence, I think it's hard to argue its fixed structural place. I would also not take for the main issue its modus operandi, the mechanism of its effectuation, namely the chains of associations, which is in principle unlimited in its movement and can bridge any gap between at first sight completely unconnected and random events or their signifiers, from Signorelli through Bosnia and Trafoi to sex and death. Where I would look for contingency in the inside of the psychic apparatus is in the economical aspect. Thought cathexis, drives, instincts, desires, psychic energy, libido, and so on. This might be the least systematic part of Freud's reasoning on the psychic apparatus, and the most problematic part is, I think, not the inextinguishable unconscious desire itself, and not the ability of the preconscious to counter it with counter-cathexis, but that the preconscious thought or thought itself doesn't apply its own force, that it is its own energy. For Freud, a thought itself is not sexy unless it is unconscious or at least counters the unconscious by way of being manipulated by preconscious handling of the cathexis. So not only that a thought has its own cathexis, a thought is its own energy which cannot be fully manipulated as a mere tool in the battle of the unconscious and the preconscious. Freud takes the wrong turn when he ascribes the free or unbound psychic energy merely to the unconscious part of the human psyche, because the thermodynamical lesson of this is that it is only the unconscious part of the psyche that does any work, and the preconscious or consciousness implies only a controlled and rigid flowing of psychic energy, a dead labor of counter-cathexis, so to speak. But the free or unbound psychic energy overflows the whole psychic apparatus, for it comes from the outside. It is the constant and variable direct excitation permeating the whole psychic apparatus. To put it differently, contingency as the outside is the source of any psychic energy, making the whole psychic apparatus work. On the one hand, it keeps the unconscious alive, fueling its perennial existence. And the unconscious, as cunning as it is no Maxwellian demon. It can become exhausted when preconscious thought itself starts working and binding its energies with others in its own unpredictable chain of associations. So in the last instance, neither the unconscious nor the preconscious, none of them bear any necessity of externalization. It is completely undecided as to what part of the psyche will become dominant in producing the little and inessential effect, a contingent act. So the final version of contingency testing would be, can contingency weaken the force of the unconscious and make psychic room for undecidability of externalization in our little and unimportant intentional acts? Thank you.
Well, thank you to my co-panelists. So I will be rounding off these readings of a metapsychological supplement to dreams, and then we will jump right into our panelists' discussion. So my inquiry and discussion today emerged from a short passage towards the end of this metapsychological paper. After determining the topographical boundaries of reality testing, Freud proposes the following. We can, I quote, "We can already learn from pathology the way in which reality testing may be done away with or put out of action. In psychosis, the ego breaks off its relation to reality. It withdraws the cathexis from the system CS. With this turning from reality, reality testing is got rid of. The unrepressed, completely conscious, wishful fantasies are able to press forward into the system, and they are there regarded as a better reality. Such a withdrawal may be put on par with the processes of repression," end quote. In the same year, in the paper titled The Unconscious, Freud characterizes all transpositions of representations between different systems in terms of inscriptions and records of representations. Implicatively, metapsychological mechanisms like repression act upon some curious form of writing, a writing of the psyche, or psychical writing. My inquiry today regards relations that allow such re-editions, as it were, of reality to emerge in psychosis. Precisely, I will advance the thesis that though reality testing may be abandoned, psychosis exposes, and here an emphasis on exposes, a prior underwriting of relationality and delimitation. And this is not an isolated instance of Freud's recourse to orthographic imagery, and I'm not the first to observe that Freud frequently uses such imagery and metaphors. And more importantly, I'm not the first to recognize that his use is not merely illustrative. In Freud et la scène de l'écriture, Jacques Derrida identifies the same facet, chronicling its inception in the 1895 Project for a Scientific Psychology and its life for decades afterwards. Though Derrida and I are pursuing the same line of inquiry, my presentation concerns a much narrower selection of Freud's texts, in conjunction with Jacques Lacan's case history of Aimée from his medical thesis, a woman diagnosed with paranoid psychosis, and I will be specifically focusing on excerpts from her novels, which Lacan includes in his case assessment of her. Through Aimé's literary productions, Freud's metapsychology, and Lacan's metapsychology, I hope to raise the question of the connection between the psychical writing and its underwriting of the relation between inner and outer, as we've been discussing for a long time now, and the privileged relation of a so-called normal psychology that has not forsworn reality testing. And briefly, before I dive into a description of the case history of Aimée and the features of her paranoia, I want to make a few qualifications for the audience and any potential future online viewers. I'm well aware that Lacan did not stricto sensu analyze Aimée. She was admitted to the hospital that Lacan was working at as he was working on a psychiatric thesis because she had attempted to stab the famous actress Huguette Duflo. This was a psychiatric evaluation, and Lacan's medical thesis could arguably be called a psychiatric work, although I hope to push against that reading today. So, specifically, from Aimé's case, I will be focusing on a single nodal passage from Aimé's manuscript of a novel titled Ce faute respect, or With All Due Respect. I won't pretend at measuring up to Freud's analysis of Schreber's writings, but perhaps we can open up the potential for future consideration of Aimée and her writings, or what we have of them, on the basis of their own merits, just as has been done for Schreber. So Aimée was a 38-year-old woman who aspired to become a novelist and an intellectual, but was met with rejection and failure, working in an office for the French Ministerial Postal Service, refusing to fully resign herself to life as a mother, wife, and menial labor. She displayed typical signs of paranoid psychosis, delusions of grandeur, coupled with a prevailing feeling of malicious prejudice and persecution from unknown or impossible sources. She sent several letters to the then Prince of Wales to protect her from people like Huguette Duflo, and she often claimed that the Prince of Wales was her lover. So Duflo was one such source of prejudice who Aimée accused of threatening her infant son. It's worth knowing how Aimée conceived of the origin of Duflo's supposed hatred for this infant that she had never met. One day, she said, I was working at the office while searching, as always, within myself for where these threats against my son could be coming from. I heard my colleagues speak of Duflo. I understood then that it was she who resented us. Then, she goes on to say, previously at the office of E, I spoke ill of Duflo's. Everyone else agreed in declaring her well-bred, distinguished, and I protested by saying that she was a whore. That's why she must resent me. Lacan reports that none of her colleagues can verify this story, with only one person vaguely recalling that on one occasion, Aimée railed against so-called people of the theater. Aimé's preoccupation with actors, novelists, and intellectuals was intense, prolonged, and it reinforces the intimate link between her delusional organization and her own literary productions. The excerpt, which I will read out in a moment from Ce faute respect, concerns this preoccupation with a figure like Duflos. The novel is written in a style suggestive of automatic writing, the method of the surrealist writers who would celebrate Aimée after reading Lacan's thesis, though she was never herself published and never received any benefit from this fame herself. And in some ways, I think her writing is better than Breton or Aragon, but we'll leave that aside. Throughout the novel, Aimée very transparently inveighs against the worlds of theater and beaux lettres, especially so-called femmes des lettres and femmes des théâtres. The lengthy excerpt from the novel follows, and I've tried very hard to translate it in a way that doesn't lose its singular style. Courtesans are the scum of society, undermining its rights and demolishing it. They make other women the outcasts of society and ruin their reputation. As I leave the theater, I watch another procession go by. As I approach, I am confronted by the old woman with thighs worth $1 billion, her delegates with their retainers, their pimps, their henchmen in the form of journalists. On the float, her flabby body. Read under her armpit, says one stevedore to the other, beauty. Read on her coccyx, generosity. Read on her groin, intelligence. Read on her little toe, great ideas. That does not surprise me. It's been explained to me. It's an intrigue. It's a Lemurian plot. So push off. We've got to get the she-wolf skin up to the queen's height, follow the goddess of infernal machinations with her dog-haired belly, the delegates with their reeking halos, and then a goat from the French theater covered in a wet, slimy dew and a blonde toupee between its horns. Journalists made it graze on the prettiest flowers in the garden of Paris. She spread her virtues everywhere, and she is to be shunned. I can't go any further. The procession is blocking my way. It's a secret of comedy. It's labeled Honor and Fatherland. So here, a courtesan, the flabby old woman, the goddess of infernal machinations with a dog-haired belly, the goat of the French theater who devours the flowers of the Garden of Paris, Duflo stands in for them all in Aimé's delirious organization of her reality. Intriguingly, the false ideals ascribed to such a woman are written upon her body to be read by the public. And this manipulation of the written word through the image of the object of her invective and her aspiration amounts to a conspiracy concocted by devils, Lemurians, to destroy France. At the end of the novel, the narrator, Aimé, where Lecan derives her pseudonym, returns to her provincial family homestead to an atmosphere of muted anger and dread, which she ascribes to the reign of shame, and all of the family devour each other in a strange, surreal scene. This reign of shame is supposedly the order of the world produced by the public's belief in the words written upon the body of the flabby old woman, the world that makes reputable women social outcasts. All of this, Lecan will conclude in the thesis itself, satisfies a self-punishment. In striking at the successful women of the theater with pen and blade, Aimé succeeds in punishing herself for her perceived inadequacies as a writer, a sister, a wife, and a mother. Thus, circuitously, Aimé's unrepressed self-punishment fantasy fulfills her wish, and she finds enjoyment only after several intermediary rewritings of the tableau and the roles therein. Now, this is a far cry from the more sophisticated account of foreclosure, the mechanism undergirding psychosis as Lecan will identify it in Semaine 3, more than 2 decades after the publication of Aimé's case. Nonetheless, I will attempt to synthesize one aspect of Aimé's literary productions with one crucial feature of foreclosure, that mechanism on par with repression. And this will not merely solidify the Lacanian position on psychosis, but will suggest a question regarding the experience of the relation between the inner world of the subject and the exterior world of reality as it is underwritten by the same elements that permit reality testing itself. So, in Semaine 3, Lecan tells us that in the psychotic subject, certain elementary phenomena, and especially hallucinations, which are their most characteristic forms, show us a subject completely identified either with his ego, with which he speaks, or with the ego assumed entirely under an instrumental mode. So what is the character of Aimé's paranoid delusions? Does she completely identify with her ego, or is the ego assumed under an entirely instrumental mode? Consider how she describes the origin of her belief that Duflo threatens her infant son. Her colleagues mention Duflo in a conversation, and from that supposedly overheard conversation, Aimé comes to the knowledge that Duflo is her persecutor. Is the elementary phenomenon a hallucination here? It would seem so, given that none of her colleagues can recollect the other conversation where Aimé supposedly called Duflo a whore. Something is occurring between the subject, her ego ideal, who Duflo represents, and the little o others of her colleagues as she imagines them. She, quote, searches within herself, and through herself her ego speaks. You get Duflo threatens your child. She speaks through her ego to herself with no reference to the intersubjective big other, since she does not listen to what her colleagues say about the actress, but merely absorbs the coincidence of their conversation with her interior source, or her interior search for the source of the threats. Thus she exists with the consequences of what Lecan will call foreclosure. But the excerpt from the novel reveals something further and something more subjective, or something more suggestive in the context of an understanding of metapsychology. The infernal goddess on the procession's float is marked by certain signifiers: beauty, intelligence, generosity, and great ideas. All things Aimé aspires to, dreams of embodying, marked not in the image of the old woman, but in the writing she carries on the intimate areas of her body. Then there are the stevedores who point out to one another where to find these words. And we have here a relation of the ego ideal on 2 levels. Between the subject, in a very ambivalent color, and between the socius, le patrie, the fatherland, the completely imaginary little o others who live drab lives and are taken in by the words and do not see the truth of the image. They don't see the plot that Duflo represents. Aimé sees the Lemurian plot, though. She sees the social symbolic relation for a charade, but the rest do not see. And this is, I think, quite a nice way of summarizing what paranoia is at the end of the day. Now, Aimé is aware, like Schreiber, that the details of reality are uncertain and that the claims she makes are dubious. While most of her persecutors are women like Duflos, the rotating cast of these persecutors evinces that Aimée knows in some manner that her sense of reality is subject to doubt. In contrast, what is assuredly certain for Aimée and not so certain for so-called normal subjects is that there is something in her world that relates to her especially. Through her complete identification with her ego, there is no test of what exists in reality. But there is also no means to test the reality of interpretations. There are only images of the social symbolic, and they're not worthy of interpretation because they're all false. Indeed, something of this symbolic order is identified as completely exterior, and its relation to the inner egoical world of the subject is considered certainly hostile, short-circuiting the primordial judgment of reality testing, according to Freud in the paper Negation from 1925, and presenting a clear case of the abandonment or cessation of reality testing as he describes it in a metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams. In this case, the femmes de théâtre stand in for this exterior and hostile force, and the relation between this hostility and Aimé's ego is a constant, certain cause of anxiety, despite the changing substitutes for this exteriority. So we can say that for Aimée, there is a relation, indeed there are relations, and not only can they be written, but it is her ego that writes them for herself. And these relations are certain despite the rewritten reality being dubious and untestable. Returning now to the passage from Freud that serves as my pivot, in psychosis, the ego breaks off its relation to reality. Aimé's literary productions and her own attempts to explain why Duflos threatens her child demonstrate the special status of relation in paranoid psychosis. Given that foreclosure facilitates the complete identification of the subject with the ego, a particular facet of the relations normally tested by the ego becomes transparent. Reality testing is forsworn to such an extent that the character of the relation between ego, subject, and little o others is certain, and doubt about these relations is foreclosed along with the foreclosure of the big other and the signifier which represents it. Not every psychosis, however, is preluded or punctuated by the production of a highly systematized piece of literal writing, of course, but it is cases like Aimé's and Schreber's that demonstrate the proximity of what we are wont to call personality or ego, and an underwriting guaranteeing some passage between this ego and exterior reality. Indeed, the space of repression identified by Derrida, a space ripe for the production of symptoms and signs written by the psyche, does not reveal this functional underwriting and its nature as explicitly as the space exposed by foreclosure, that mechanism on par with repression, as Freud says. While the space of repression does not exclude an exteriority, like a force or image, foreclosure, on the other hand, and by definition, repels or it precludes the big O other precisely with the complete unconscious identification of this other with exteriority itself. Thus, the capacity to delimit interiority and exteriority, and to identify sameness or difference even, are not what is foreclosed in psychotic subjects. This suggests that the establishment of relations in so-called normal psychology pre-exists reality testing itself. The underwriting of the inner-outer delimitation and of the typical delimitations between subject, ego, little o others, and the big O other is recalibrated in the psychotic structure to such an extent that reality can be rewritten and the relation between and amongst all elements of reality take on the quality of near absolute certainty. So, as Lacan wrote, nobody goes mad through wanting to, and he pasted these on the walls of his quarters in the same hospital he treated Aimée. Yet Freud's metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams and the analyzable evidence from a text like Sauf autre respect suggests that it is by the very means of reason and judgment, like those subtending reality testing, that one becomes certain both of the relation between themselves and the image of their ego, and those relations between this image and others. In other words, the paranoid core of ego formation depends upon a certain fabricated, written, and confused certainty of relation, which at base is that simple relation and delimitation between inner and outer. We might call the certainty of relations upon foreclosure in psychosis a more pronounced and hardened face of an amphibole Kant identifies in the Critique of Pure Reason, namely the amphibole of the concepts of reflection produced by the confusion between the empirical and transcendental uses of the understanding. The near absolute certainty of the relation and delimitation between inner and outer, as evidenced in Aimé's novel and other cases of acute paranoid psychosis, amounts to this confusion in an extreme manner. Thus, the space of writing and the modes of expression revealed by foreclosure expose more than just a dysfunction of the understanding. They also demonstrate the priority of relationality over reality testing, judgment, and perhaps the understanding itself. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, 20 minutes.
Yeah, so we actually have much more time than we anticipated for the discussion, which I'm sure all of my co-panelists are thrilled about. So I'd like to start us off with a question directed to Aleš specifically, and then from there we can get going. So, Aleš, you've claimed that a thought might have its own cathexis, which is not invested in the inside, but also to the outside. And precisely in this thought cathexis, we could perhaps find the internal contingency of the psychic apparatus. So it seems to me that the certainty that a paranoid subject, like Aimé or another paranoid subject, affords to the relations between the external world and themselves are an example of such a thought and such an object that do not sit neatly on the inside or the outside. So I'm not suggesting that Aimé's objects, as she identifies them outside, are an example of something you described, but rather the relations that she believes subtend this reality are such an object. So she raises the written word and the space of literature, as in the ink on page and the fictive place fabricated by literature, to posit a type of thought that is invested in both the inside and the outside. And does she only do this by virtue of the power and attribution of linguistic or symbolic meaning? In other words, what might be the relation or lack of relation between language or the symbolic and the contingency testing you propose? Or perhaps, in other words, is the symbolic and language itself really that contingent condition of the unconscious that you seem to want to discover?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Holden, for the question. I'll answer in a bit more Freudian language and a bit less Lacanian one. I think that we kind of all agree, and I guess it's not a surprise that we all kind of criticize that the notion of like externality and internality. Like there's a clear division between the internal and the external. So yeah, I think the main problem is how to connect them. What's the relationship between the internal and the external? We all I think even listed like there is 2 or 3 or I don't know how many. So yeah, I actually agree with your point. If I understood you correctly, there is a sort of relation even when Freud talks about hallucination with on the case of dreams. I think that he would actually agree with everything because he says like dreams have this ability even when our like sensory experience is cut off in a way, we somehow still perceive what is going on. So there is some sort of relation that is coming from the outside. Like for example, Lacanians love this "Father, can you see I'm burning" dream that Freud mentions, and here is obviously you can see that like the external like happening is somehow inscribing into the internal processes of his dreams. So yeah, it's a really complicated part to like delineate or connect this the internal and the external. But what I try to do is to like posit the internal in the external in the internal to delimit the unconscious itself. Not for because okay, psychosis it's you can see like a person has problems, not with reality, not through reality testing though. But my question is, what about the unconscious? When it's not pathological, how do we like posit the externality to the unconscious itself, not only in relation to psychosis? So I try to like show the contingency of the psychonetic object itself to the unconscious. So this is why I try to like to talk about like psychic energies, which sounds a bit funny, I guess, to somehow eliminate the effectivity of the unconscious. Even if it does have its own effects, even if it has its own force of externalization, are there some counter forces that are not like counter cathexis, that are not like being manipulated from the ego or I don't know, like a conscious autonomous ego or something like that? So this was like my this is how I try to position the problem of the inside and the outside in the human psyche itself in relation to the unconscious.
There are two things you've raised which remind me of remarks that Marisa brought up. The first is the triviality of the object, which both you and Marisa highlighted, but also the potential for these sort of counter forces to run against a so-called like normal object that would be operating in everyday life. So I wonder, Marisa, since you commented on the triviality or banality of the objects at issue, supposedly the banality or triviality, I mean, do you think that the problem of the nightmare as a potential disturbance of the sleep falls into the same sort of problems that Aleš is identifying? Is it potentially an example of the sort of counterforce that he's raised as a possibility?
I mean, I think that with the topic of a nightmare in Freud's theory, I find it very interesting that even though he kind of denies the existence of this banal object and says, well, dreams are important, you know, I should write a whole book about it and more. But it's very interesting that when it comes to the question of the nightmare, he treats it as a sort of an unimportant subject within his theory of dreams. With it, you know, he kind of answers the objections that were rising, you know, against his theory of dreams being a wish fulfillment. And I find it very interesting how he kind of gets a kind of hold of it in a way of saying, well, you know, it's not something that kind of denies itself. It's not like the end of the theory, but just includes it into it. So in a sense, like, what I wanted to comment about the internal, external conversation that we, I guess, kind of spontaneously started to have, I find it very interesting how it is possible to think Freud's theory of psychical processes, like in general, in a sense, spatially, or in a sense, like, as Voranc, I think, showed, it's something that maybe it should be thought exactly in that way. I mean, we have all, like, the history of cases and all the material that, you know, it's very rich in Freud's work. But the speciality of, like, just thinking of the topological character of his theory, it adds something to it, in a sense. I think it even enables the possibility of thinking it, basically. I mean, just a suggestion, in a sense. But this is what I got out of a supplement as well, and when trying to figure out in how he places the nightmare into the process of a formation of dreams. So
yeah,
just quickly. Yeah.
I think, I mean, the way in which Voranc posed the question at the end of your talk, Voranc, regarding the spatiality as a sort of not even just, again, a merely illustrative metaphor, but something which is at the foundation. I wonder if you could elaborate on that in light of what both Aleš and Marisa have just said.
In relation to Aleš's point, I immediately started thinking of the relation in general in Freud between him trying to put in place an apparatus, a theoretical apparatus, and of course a system. But on the other hand, he's dealing with all of this, all of those contingencies, all of those extra cases, special cases, not even cases, almost cases, everyday life, extra, like a nightmare, which is a weird it's a everyday occurrence. Well, I hope it's not an everyday occurrence, but it's a, you know, we do dream nightmares from time to time. It's not really a pathology, although it feels pathological every time. You know, so you're just Freud trying to get this the system on the one hand, and then the space of contingency of randomness on the other, and of everydayness, which really falls together with contingency in randomness, at least in my life. And then so this is one point. And then in relation to the spatiality, I just feel with this, for example, I couldn't elaborate on this enough, but there is this analogy with the room and the rooms, and immediately, at least and the same thing with the plasmapodia protrusions, with the analogy with the cell, you can see of having some kind of a concepts that, you know, have to work in relation one to the other in some spatial way. So either there are rooms, and then you try to fit phenomena, or you need to locate instances in these spatial concepts, and I don't think it's just a way of describing it. I think it's a way of thinking it also. You know, you have some concepts that try to rigidly or dynamically as possible take account of the world, and then you have the world itself, and it's in this contingency, with this contingency characteristic that, you know, needs to engage this the systematic part of theory. Mm-hmm. I hope it made any sense. Yeah. What I wanted to say.
Yeah. Well, so this status of the spatiality, sort of at bottom of Freud's methodology, is something I want to discuss, because it will bring us back to a point I want to return to that Aleš made initially. But it deals, to be more specific, I'm going to allude to that same phrase that Derrida used, that I quoted, which is this space of repression where symptoms come to live and thrive. So I think this is another spatial metaphor, now Derrida's, but nonetheless in line with Freud's, which is acting exactly as you say. It's something to think through. It's something which actually permits the thinking through, and is not merely sort of an example that demonstrates. So in this regard, is not a psychological symptom another form of the thought object that is both inner and outer? And then if so, what is the actual status of this space where reality testing can be instituted, abandoned, or exaggerated? I guess what I'm sort of trying to get at is, it doesn't seem like we can identify this prior space of writing, relations, symptoms, whatever, without a dysfunction of normal, so-called normal psychology. So my question, I mean, Voranc, Aleš, Marisa, feel free to respond as you would. But yeah, is not a symptom another form of this inner-outer object, but really an object that is neither inner and outer?
I can answer, but I'll pose a question to you. So yeah, I think it's like justifiable to talk about like the dynamic, the topological aspects and the inside and the outside, and as you said, like espacement, what's the correct term? But does it imply some sort of like dynamics? Like, is Aimé in a way forced to write the diaries? Like, for example, Schrader has his own idea what to do with his diaries. So my question would be, when is like the force of this espacement big enough to like produce a literary production or something like that? Yeah. So like to also not just talk about like the topographical or topological aspects, but also to the economical aspects. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, I would hesitate to go so far as to say that there must be some sort of energetic threshold that must be met before Schreber or Aimé could say, now I write, in a sense. But I think you raise an important question insofar as perhaps the tool of spatiality as a metaphor that Freud is using to think through these things is carrying with it some prior weight already, insofar as it would then assume that every psychosis has a delirious system. And I mean, many psychotic statements do in some way imply a system, but the exact status of that system in relation to the necessity of the spatiality or that Freud employs, I can't answer as to what condition must be met in order to force the writing.
I was just wondering because if you have a psychosis, it's like it would be like great to write a novel on it. Better to be in asylum. So So what is like the key to be a productive novelist when you're having a psychosis? I'm just kidding, but
yeah. I mean, Voranc, you also wanted to say something in response.
Well, I would, in relation to the symptom in the space, I would say, and in relation to the symptom and the amoeba. So, for example, the metaphor of the amoeba doesn't really possess any more developed instances. It just possesses. It's just something that happens inside and outside of a membrane. And but I think it's funny. It's not funny, but interesting is that how in this case, like the consciousness, so the ego comes last into the picture. So, for example, there is this metaphor that doesn't even have the capacity of the ego or the consciousness. So, in a way, something needs to take place even before the ego can arise. Some kind of a form of accumulation of catexis and the catexis that produce something that can even have the capability of reality testing in itself. So in a way, we are already talking about, in a way, a symptom when we talk about the ego or the system of consciousness. And what is most important in this spatial terms is what we debated this with Marisa just when thinking about this text, that how in the other metaphor that I employ, the metaphor of the rooms. So there is not a room dedicated for consciousness, for ego. So the consciousness is just somewhere in the drawing room, right? In the saloon. It's not so there is certain parts of the apparatus have their own specialized metaphor, and then there are like more contingent instances that travel through or just pass by, just in a way. So in this sense, it's a bit characteristic of the symptom also that can also transmute, change places, and so on. I mean, that's why I was emphasizing this spatialness, because it's something that it's hard to. Sometimes Freud even says, maybe the topographical approach is maybe not the most correct one, but it's definitely the most practical one. So let's just use this in terms of just making theory work with the world. It's what's important. So, yeah.
I wonder, since we keep coming back to the advantages, limits, disadvantages of Freud's topographical model versus his economic model. So I want to turn to the very final paragraph of the text that we discussed today, and I'll briefly summarize it. Don't worry, I'm not going to force you to recall it from memory. But he claims that in dreams, libidinal investment is withdrawn equally from the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious systems. And in transference neuroses, it is withdrawn from the preconscious system. And in one set of psychoses, which Freud names schizophrenia, cathexis is withdrawn from the unconscious, and Ame is an example of this. In amantia, the investment is withdrawn from the conscious system. All of these deal with the presence or absence of a relation completely internal to the subject and her psychical apparatus. So it's a movement of energy to different rooms, if we could say, but these rooms they're completely internal on the topographical model. So I wonder, in light of our readings today, how and to what extent we can maintain these delimitations and relations completely internal to the subject and its psychical apparatus. So for a moment, not discuss the establishment of a relation between inner and outer, but the internal relations established either through imagery or symbolism or what So really, what is the ontological status of these systems seen as descriptions of spaces, places, or rooms where meaning is generated or written, or conversely, where energy is put or moved or redistributed?
I must say, I find it is a very interesting point in the sense of, because this is how I was also trying to think it. I mean, in the sense of thinking the formation of dream itself in a sort of in a sort of sorry, just lost it a bit. In a sort of how it accumulates through the directions, the whole motion and the tendency of the unconscious wish, in a sense, takes. Because there's also like a certain, we don't only have space, but there's also like some time limit in a sense. Freud says about the unconscious that nothing is forgotten, nothing is past in there, but in a sense, like it functions, at least in the dream, it's something of a residue of the present in a sense, but it always needs to be gathered on and picked out retroactively in a sense. And that's why also, to come back to the speciality of his theory, I find it very interesting when thinking of it through the directions and motions it takes. So that progressive and regressive path, and then progressive again. It seems that it's just sort of almost that it hits something, and then this causes the motion of going back, and then comes tumbling on through again, and sometimes even like through the censorship out to the motorics. And I think this is probably the point where he connects the question of dreams with his theory on neurosis and the symptom. So, just that. Well,
You have nothing to say?
Yeah, I guess I have. Not so much as a response to Marisa, but it's always like confusing to read, to make sense of Freud's psychic apparatuses, because when you talk about preconscious, it's like you cannot argue that it's merely preconscious. It has to be, I guess, at least from what I was saying, it has to be some sort of different unconscious, something like that, or at least a different functioning of the unconscious. So it's always, you get quite like confused when at least Freud is talking about like the preconscious and consciousness itself. So it's hard to like make sense of all of the spatial metaphors that he uses. And I have most problems about his notion of consciousness. Actually, the unconscious is fine. The preconscious, I think that can be reworked or reinterpreted as something else. But the consciousness, I think it's a bit like too, I don't buy it, like this internal perception. Of course, it's a bit more complicated, but at least from this text that we've been dealing with today, it's like you get the feeling that there are some things that you can internally, you have some sort of internal perception, and you can do stuff with what's going on in the inside. So you have, of course, then this breakage between the preconscious and the unconsciousness. So where is the repression? Who does the repressing part? So every time, that's actually my point. Every time that I try to take seriously, that I try to define different aspects of the psych apparatus, it falls apart for me. That would be the point. Yeah.
Well, I think then this sort of note of doubt and skepticism about the status of consciousness is actually a perfect place to leave this first panel and move on to the rest of this conference on the relation between psychoanalysis and philosophy. So thank you again to my co-panelists.